to the author of People Like Us. It's a vivid first-hand account of the author's experience of being the first ever female private secretary to Margaret Thatcher, or to the PM, I should say. I don't know whether it was Thatcher, actually. Caroline Slocock, was it Thatcher that you were a private secretary to? Hello.
Yes, hello, good evening.
Good evening.
Yes, I worked for her in her last 18 months as Prime Minister. And in fact, I was the only other woman in the room when she resigned in front of her cabinet. So I saw her at very close quarters, and I was the first female private secretary at number 10, and managed to slip through because she'd apparently issued a ban on women being put forward for the job. So I've got a very unusual perspective on her because there were very few women around her.
Why
but
did...
also, I was just to be clear on this, just because I think your listeners will be interested. I was a civil servant, and actually I was not a political supporter, and I still am not of her, but I do admire some of her qualities.
Yeah, because of course, many times when you're in the civil service, you've got to sort of put that aside, haven't you? And just do the job that you're being given to do. Why do you think, from your perception and from working with her, she didn't like to be surrounded by other women in work?
I think it was partly because she had worked all her life in a very male environment, and she understood that world, and she was comfortable in it. And I think also, I think that she just liked being around men. I think that was her sort of personal preference. And so for her inner circle of people, which I was in, a very sort of close inner circle, I think she felt more comfortable with men.
She liked being the only woman, didn't she?
Well, yes, she's been described as having Queen Bee syndrome, and I think there was some truth in that.
Was she ever frosty towards you, did you feel?
Yes, I mean, no and yes. No, because actually she behaved well towards me, as she did towards everybody around her, unlike, one has to say, Priti Patel. But yes, in the sense that she decided not to promote me when I had pretty much been promised, a more senior position in the private office. And I think the reason for that was actually partly because I was a woman, but possibly also because she'd sort of managed to glean, despite my best endeavours of complete neutrality, to perhaps guess that I wasn't one of us.
And do you think that she could guess that? Do you think she could smell that kind of stuff out?
I think that she'd probably reached the point. She'd always been very trusting and worked through her civil servants. And I don't think she required them to have her political beliefs. But I think in the last few moments of her premiership, which is what we're talking about here, the last few months, I think she was feeling very insecure. And I think she increasingly wanted to be surrounded by sort of true believers. So I think that was an element of it.
And do you think that she sort of lost the plot slightly towards the end, in as much as she had there are many commentators, and I don't know where you stand on it, that seem to think that there was a very different Thatcher in 1979 to the Thatcher that was in power in 1990, that she'd become perhaps a little presidential, she'd perhaps stopped listening to any of her critics, and that she had again perhaps got a bit too big for her boots. Did you see any of that yourself?
Yes, I think she had actually stopped listening. I think that one of her great qualities was that she came from quite humble background. She was the daughter of a grocer, and she often has written about this. When she was serving behind the shop, she was talking to all the people coming into the shop, and I think she was much more grounded than most conservative politicians who had this sort of rather kind of sort of gentlemanly like quality, the sort of Eton. And we see some of that today, the sort of Eton background. But as she got deeper into her premiership, and by this stage she was 11 years in, remember, I think that she increasingly became cocooned within number 10, and she was surrounded by people. I don't include myself in this, I have to say, but I think she was increasingly surrounded by people who were, reflecting her views back to her, rather than, actually kind of challenging her. And she got out of touch with her MPs. And I think the poll tax, I don't know if you remember that, you're probably too young, Cristo, but the community poll tax, as it was known popularly, was a terrible, it was a terrible mistake politically, but she dug in behind it. I do think power corrupts. Even the best of people, after a certain length of time in power, do stop listening.
I mean, I do remember the poll tax. I just wonder whether that was actually brought on by her, though, because from what I gather, and you'll know this better than I do, that you're right. She surrounded herself by yes men and women towards the end, but that's because whenever anyone was a no man or woman, they wouldn't be tolerated, because then they wouldn't be on board with the agenda. And from what I gather, any of the naysayers or people who pointed out caution with the poll tax were given very, very short shrift. So I think you're right, in as much as one of the qualities of being a good leader is, I suppose, to listen to those people telling you that you're getting it wrong. But I suppose if you're someone who perhaps has had to fight to get your way to the top, and you've had people telling you that you've been getting it wrong all along, and you followed your own instinct, it becomes very difficult to then know when someone's right and when they're not.
I think that's absolutely spot on. I mean, I have a sort of I read English at university, and I, love Shakespeare, and I have this theory, which I felt was very strongly proven by Margaret Thatcher and my seeing her close too, which is that one's very strengths become one's weaknesses. And her strength, I think, was that she was very driven. She had a very clear sense of what she wanted to achieve, and she was determined to push it through, come what may. But that very quality actually served her badly towards the end, because she believed too much in herself and not enough in some of the other things which she might have been hearing. But the other thing which was happening to her, because I, amongst other things, was by her side whenever she went out of number 10 in Britain, was that whenever we were out, we would sort of fly in helicopters and fly down. I remember flying down into a Welsh valley, which is probably the most dangerous place for her to go, because she was so hated by the coal mining community. But this was a mine that had been closed some years ago. But we flew in, and everybody that we met was in awe of her, because she was by then a legend. Whenever they met her, you could see there was this sort of look on people's faces like, I'm going to tell my grandchildren that I met Margaret Thatcher. And so they didn't sort of say, look, you destroyed our community, or, whatever they might have been feeling. They were very polite, positive, and she was very polite and positive with them. So she didn't actually understand how unpopular she had become. She just wasn't getting that vibe, if you like, when she was going out there. So I think that was part of the disconnect that set in for her. And I mean, did you? She made a point where I felt that she really had, she did need to go.
I can see that. I mean, at the time, I remember being devastated, but looking back on history, 11 and a half years to be a prime minister, that probably is around the time when you need to go. I do wonder, though, because when you look at today's politicians, did you, in your experience in the 18 months in which you worked for her, did you ever hear her or do or say something in order to be liked?
No.
Because that to me is the most fundamental difference between Margaret Thatcher and the leaders we have today, is and again, it's probably the thing that did for her in the end, but she didn't care whether people liked her that much or not, because if she thought she was right, that was, anyone's opinion on her opinion was secondary to her. And I just wanted to explore with you whether you ever thought, did she ever hold up the finger and say, well, I'm actually going to go in this direction because that's the more popular way of being, or not?
She was a politician, so obviously she would, she'd be advised by her political advisors, in elections about, the policies that might win votes. So, she wasn't impervious to that sort of thing, clearly. And she was very successful. But the thing which I think marks her out is that she did have a very strong vision, and she spent some years in opposition, working with others to determine the direction of travel that she wanted to go. And she was very committed to that. And she had a quality which is, I think, really quite rare, but was extremely effective, which is that she had a very clear sense of direction, but she also had a really good grasp of the detail. And she worked incredibly hard on her boxes. You know, she did 5 boxes a night. You know, every night she would do them dutifully. She would go right through them. She would underline every bit. And, you know, that meant that she had an edge. She had an edge on everybody, really. She had an edge on her ministers, who often didn't have as good a grasp of the detail. You know, she had an edge, you know, on people when she was, you know, arguing with them. She had an edge in cabinet, you know, but it also meant that she actually pretty much knew what she was doing. You know, when I look at Boris Johnson, for example, you know, over the COVID crisis, you get the impression that it's clear because of the questions he's answered in the House and elsewhere that he doesn't read the documents. He just receives a kind of basic brief, and he sort of skates over a lot of the facts. And actually, facts matter. You know, they matter hugely to what you eventually decide to do. And, you know, she had that sort of great grit both on the direction of travel and on how you were going to get there.
Well, one of the criticisms that I've given about Boris on this show, and this is why every show ends up being, you know, what would happen if Margaret Thatcher was in charge. So we're actually doing it as a subject tonight. But look, whether you loved or loathed Thatcher, and there are going to be people who think the same, either side, who have both different opinions of her. But even the most vehement Labour supporter, I think, would not be able to, would not think for a second, in comparison to the leaders we have today, that Mrs. Thatcher would not. I mean, if you just think about Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, I mean, they would be getting the hairdryer treatment. They would be leaving that meeting with Margaret Thatcher probably needing therapy, because they would have been questioned and questioned and questioned and questioned, and they would have been then questioned again, and then they would have had their data thrown back at them and then probably re-questioned again. And then any decision made, you know that every single person around Margaret Thatcher would have had to have justified that decision 100 different ways. And so you know the decisions being made, whether you're a Thatcher fan or not, were based on her grasp of detail and what should happen next. I've no faith that anyone who is in our overseeing COVID at the moment, that in any of the meetings with Whitty and Vallance or anyone else, that level of detail is being achieved.
Yeah, I would agree with you about that. I mean, I think, you know, she wouldn't necessarily have been unpleasant to them, but she would have been very rigorous, and she had a particular interest in science. Remember, she was a scientist herself. The other thing that she would have done, actually, which I think is very important and has been totally lacking, is, you know, she was very aware of the international dimension. You know, she was people don't often realize this, but she was probably the first champion of tackling global warming. She went to the UN and she was looking for targets. You know, this is 30 years ago. And I think she would have been out there on the international stage trying to coordinate international efforts around COVID. When, of course, COVID isn't just a disease in Britain. You know, a lot of the problem have been that people crossing borders, and actually international action is a very, very important part of it. And because of the nature of Donald Trump, and also I think the weakness of our own leadership, Britain has not had a leading role. Gordon Brown, you know, who has his weaknesses, obviously, but, you know, in the international economic crisis of 2008, you know, he was out there working with, you know, across the globe, working to try and get, you know, effective international action. And she was able to do that. She was able to both, you know, zoom in on the detail, but zoom out to the globe in a way that I think, you know, the current leaders are lacking. I mean, I think she had, for all the fact, you know, the fact that I don't support her, and I think that she did a lot of damage in a lot of areas. You know, for example, I think the divisions that we see between North and South were very much deepened by her. And I think her kind of philosophy of individualism, although it has strengths, has actually, you know, damaged social cohesion. But for all of that, I think having, you know, I worked for John Major as well as her, and he was Prime Minister, and I've worked for various ministers, and I've invested, you know, not in number 10, but in, you know, in the Treasury and elsewhere. You know, I think she did have some fantastic personal qualities, and the reason why she had such an impact, you know, we can still see her impact now, 30 years on.
Well, absolutely.
Because of those personal qualities.
I don't think you get many politicians like that.
No, and I just want to make one sort of final plug here, actually. which is, I think this was partly because she was a woman. She'd had to fight a lot of battles to get to be the first female prime minister. She also wasn't of the right social class, so she also had to fight that. She actually didn't believe in the status quo because it hadn't, wasn't creating a world in which she could thrive. And although she was certainly not a feminist in the kind of classical sense, and didn't necessarily do much for women at all, I think that the fact she was a woman made her tougher. It made her firmer. It made her, the attention to detail. She didn't take things for granted. She knew that she had to work twice as hard as any man.
Yeah, she had to be better than every single man in the room. She had to be, and in fairness, in most cases, she was.
Yeah, exactly. And that was part of her psychology. And I think if you look at sort of Boris Johnson, with his sense of entitlement, he's going to wing it. He knows that he can make a nice joke and, be down with the lads, in a comfortable sort of way. She was very different. She wasn't clubbable. She didn't have that kind of sense that, she was a team player, who...
Does that apply a little bit, perhaps, to Priti Patel? Because a lot of people have made the point that, look, is she doing... I don't know the details. I wasn't in there at the time. But a lot of people are making the point that look, there's a lot of robust language, a lot of swearing that might fly around now and then. And if a man does it, it's ignored. But when Priti Patel does it as a woman, it's suddenly bullying. And obviously, reflecting on what you're saying about Thatcher, is there anything in that, do you think?
Well, first of all, I would say that the way in which we look at Margaret Thatcher is through a sexist lens. There's a lot of misogyny in that spitting image puppet that portrayed her as a man. She was actually really very feminine, and her characteristics were to my mind.
I mean, they weren't very kind about any of them around her as well, though. I mean, I remember the famous sketch where it was like, "What about the vegetables?"
I agree. I mean, obviously, it's not a program noted for its kind of was anyone, but I think that kind of image of her as sort of mannish, kind of a fishwife, as I think Jacques Chirac called her, screeching, was unfair. And I think that the fact that people were burning effigies of her as a witch when she died in 2013 is part of that kind of long history of seeing powerful women as somehow, a threat.
Yeah.
Nasty. And I think there are double standards because a lot of men, shout and behave badly in meetings. Actually, she didn't shout. That wasn't her style. She was much more deadly than that. Now, with Priti Patel, I would say that in her own mind, she probably feels that she has to push harder than any man, and that maybe that leads to some of this behaviour that she's been exhibiting. But I think it's very counterproductive. And one of the things which distinguishes her from Margaret Thatcher is that, for all the fact that Margaret Thatcher could dress down her ministers in quite brutal ways, not shouting, but in brutal ways, when she was working with people she regarded as equals, she could be very challenging and certainly very direct. But when she was working with the staff who were supporting her, civil servants, most of them in those days, nowadays there'd be more political appointees, she was actually really thoughtful. She was really quite kind. I remember, this is a tiny thing, but it just sort of captures something of it. I remember once the hem of my skirt fell, was coming down, the threads were coming undone, and she noticed it, and she suggested that she'd sort of take me up to the flat and so she could hem up my skirt, which, funnily enough, I felt I couldn't accept because I couldn't quite cope with the idea of taking off my skirt in front of the Prime Minister. But it crossed a boundary, but it was sort of classic of her that she would notice small details about the people around her and be very kind.
Do you think she'd have been sort of on her hands and knees herself sewing it up for you?
I think she was intending to, yeah. I mean, wow. She was like that. I mean, she was sort of, with all this sort of extraordinary ability to kind of, deal with the kind of tiny things. With the big.
I could talk to you about this for absolutely hours. A couple more quick questions because we've got to go because I'm so late for the break. Firstly, how do you think she would react to Boris Johnson and Donald Trump?
Well, I don't think she would have Boris Johnson in her cabinet. I
don't think she'd have him in the building.
Because, she could spot, somebody who hasn't got a grip, a mile off. So I I think Donald Trump, now that would be very, very tricky for her, because she relied, I think, on rapport, and I think she would have found it very, very hard to achieve rapport with him, because I think she could see, she would,
Well, he's another one. He's very similar in as much as he's got the talk, but there's not a knot, perhaps,
yeah, well,
to back it up.
I mean, I think she forged these incredibly important relationships with Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, which helped to eventually end the Cold War, and they were based on mutual respect and trust. And I think they trusted her because they knew that when she said something, she meant it. She was authentic. She would do it. The trouble with Boris Johnson is he will say something, and then next day he'll say something else
and deny he said the thing the day before, even though it will have been on record.
Exactly. So I think she would have really struggled with those two.
And do you intend to watch any of the portrayals of her, especially most recently in The Crown?
I have watched The Crown. In fact, I wrote about it in the Sunday Telegraph.
What did you think? Because I'm interested to know what you thought of Gillian Anderson's portrayal.
Well, I thought it had, it had some very good aspects to it. I didn't think it was fully rounded. I didn't think it was as good as Meryl Streep in The Iron Lady, which I thought was absolutely spot on. Meryl managed to capture some of the humanity, the softer side that people.
In fairness, none of the humanity was really written for her in The Crown, though. I mean, I think that a lot of that, because I personally think Gillian Anderson's portrayal was formidable, but the material wasn't very redeeming.
Yeah, there was a sort of crying over Mark and all that sort of thing. But it was in that sense, the script was quite sort of harsh, but it was also it gave her respect for her courage and determination and her grit. And I think it captured that side really well. And what I liked about her performance was I think she captured the intelligence and steeliness of Thatcher. That sort of cutting right to it, and also that kind of focus. And the way in which she didn't shout, but she actually could sort of be quite deadly in the way that she nailed a point and made it softly but powerfully. It was actually very true to Margaret Thatcher. So I did think
I agree with that.
She was actually quite good.
I agree, and I thought, without giving too much away, and I'm not going to give away what happens, even though everyone knows, but I just thought it was amazing that literally every scene with the Queen, Margaret Thatcher doesn't shut up until one scene where finally she is dumbstruck at something that the Queen does. But I did think it was funny that literally even with the sovereign, she sits down and she almost handbags the Queen by giving her opinion on pretty much everything. Really good to talk to you. Really interesting, Caroline, author of People Like Us. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us tonight here on Talk Radio. That's Caroline Slocock, who is the author of People Like Us, which is sounds like, I can't wait to read it actually, first-hand account of her experience as the first ever female private secretary to the first ever female Prime Minister.